"My, but it's lovely and warm in here," she said. "Do sit down." Mrs. Murray indicated a chair. "Would you like a sandwich, Mrs. Watson? I've had liverwurst and cream cheese. Charles has had bread and jam, and Meg lettuce and tomato." "Now, let me see," Mrs. Watson pondered. "I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar." "You peaked!" Charles cried indignantly. "We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any." Mrs. Watson gave a deep and pathetic sigh. "No!" Charles said. "Now, you mustn't give it to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about tuna fish salad?" "All right," Mrs. Watson said meekly. "I'll fix it," Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish. For crying out loud, she thought. This old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and Mother takes it as though there weren't anything peculiar about it at all. I'll bet she's the tramp. I'll bet she did steal those sheets. And she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to ordinary people. "I've only been in the neighborhood a short time," Mrs. Watson was saying, as Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with the tuna fish. "And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all until dear little Charles came over with his dog." "Mrs. Watson," Charles Wallace demanded severely, "why did you take Mrs. Buncombe's sheets?" "Well, I needed them, Charles dear." "You must return them at once." "But Charles dear, I can't. I've used them." "It was wrong of you," Charles Wallace scolded. "If you needed sheets that badly, you should have asked me." Mrs. Watson shook her head and clucked. "You can't spare any sheets. Mrs. Buncombe can." Meg cut up some celery and mixed it with the tuna. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a jar of little sweet pickles. Though why I'm doing it for her, I don't know, she thought, as she cut them up. I don't trust her one bit. "Tell your sister I'm all right," Mrs. Watson said to Charles. "Tell her my intentions are good." "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," Charles intoned. "My, but isn't he cunning?" Mrs. Watson beamed at him fondly. "It's lucky he has someone to understand him." "But I'm afraid he doesn't," Mrs. Murray said. "None of us is quite up to Charles." "But at least you aren't trying to squash him down." Mrs. Watson nodded her head vigorously. "You're letting him be himself." "Here's your sandwich," Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Watson. "Do you mind if I take my boots off before I eat?" Mrs. Watson asked, picking up the sandwich nevertheless. "Listen." She moved her feet up and down in her boots, and they could hear water squelching. "My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are a mite too tight for me, and I never can take them off by myself." "I'll help you," Charles offered. "Not so. You're not strong enough." "I'll help." Mrs. Murray squatted at Mrs. Watson's feet, yanking on one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came suddenly. Mrs. Murray sat down with a thump. Mrs. Watson went tumbling backward with the chair onto the floor. Sandwich held high in one old claw. Water poured out of the boot and ran over the floor and the big braided rug. "Oh, dearie me," Mrs. Watson said, lying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air, one in a red and white striped sock, the other still booted. Mrs. Murray got to her feet. "Are you all right, Mrs. Watson?" "If you have some liniment, I'll put it on my dignity," Mrs. Watson said, still supine. I think it's sprained. A little oil of cloves mixed well with garlic is rather good." And she took a large bite of sandwich. "Do please get up," Charles said. "I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far. Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity?" But Mrs. Watson scrambled up, righted the chair, and then sat back down on the floor. The booted foot stuck out in front of her, and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman. At least, Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Watson, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray, "No, pull while I'm already down," quite calmly, as though this old woman and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary. Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot. This foot was covered with a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Watson sat there wiggling her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. "Ah," she said, "that's ever so much better," and took both boots and shook them out over the sink. "My stomach is full, and I'm warm inside and out. It's time I went home." "Don't you think you'd better stay till morning?" Mrs. Murray asked. "Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's so much to do I just can't waste time sitting around frivoling." "It's much too wild a night to travel in." "Wild nights are my glory," Mrs. Watson said. "I just got caught in a downdraft and blown, of course." "Well, at least till your socks are dry." "Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing around in my boots. Now, don't worry about me, lamb." Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray. "I shall just sit down for a moment and bump on my boots, and then I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, pet, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract." Mrs. Murray went very white, and with one hand reached backward and clutched at a chair for support. Her voice trembled. What did you say?" Mrs. Watson tugged at her second boot. "I said," she grunted, shoving her foot down in, "there is such a thing as a tesseract." Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbing shawls, scarves, and hat, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray stayed very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed. "Mother, what's the matter?" Meg cried. "What did she say? What is it?" "The tesseract," Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known?